Hi, hello. My name is Blanca Estela Soto Medrano, and today I'm going to be talking about translation. First of all, I'm going to talk about the history of translation, and I'm going to talk about some approaches on translation, and finally, I'm going to talk about translation as a teaching tool. All right, so to start with, we go back to this is the timeline of the translation history. We start with Egyptians back in the 1300s before Christ. In those times, there were two languages that were used in the ancient Egypt. The hieroglyphics, that's what we connect more with the Egyptians, and there was another language called a hieratic. The hieratic language was the language of the people, the language that was spoken by the slaves, by the regular people, not the ruling class. And let's just remember that during those times there were only specific peoples who knew how to write, and the writers had these two representations of the language. So we can say that it is a sort of translation of the hieroglyphics into hieratic language. Then we are going to talk about Aramaic. Aramaic is said to come from Aram, who was the Noah's grandson from this ancient uh, Bible's history of Noah and after the flooding. All right, so the here we have Aramaic. Aramaic was a language used in the Middle East, and in 1010 before Christ, Solomon was born, and Solomon was known for his wisdom. And there is a writing found from Solomon which records all the languages that were written in his times. And there is a sort of table for equivalent letters. Letters in Hebrew have a meaning of a number, like Aleph is number one, and there was an equivalent for all the ancient languages. Here we have the hieroglyphics, we have Greek, we have Sanskrit, some alphabets called angelic from angels. There was also the magicians language and the Sanskrit, as I think I already said that, and all the old languages that were used back then. And Aramaic was the language of merchants, was the language that helped transfer culture, transfer all the products and the things that were used during those times. And here we have an important finding that was made during Napoleonic times. Although it was not translated and nobody knew how to translate it, the Rosetta Stone is known to or is dated from the 200 before Christ. In this Rosetta Stone, this is a Rosetta Stone, was written in three languages. And Demotic language, the Demotic was the language used in Egypt after 750 before Christ. And then we have the hieroglyphics, and we also have Greek. This was written in Greek because back then Alexander the Great had expanded his empire and had included Egypt, and therefore the ruling class was then back then Greek. So Greeks this was written in those three languages. It was not possible to decipher it until a great translator appeared in the scene. The Rosetta Stone is now in England, but Jean-Francois Champollion was the one who finally deciphered this Rosetta Stone. He spoke Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, he learned Syriac, Persian, Coptic, and Aramaic. And he was so smart that he helped decipher this. And thanks to him, the Egypt people who studied Egypt were able, well, he was considered an Egyptologist because he helped decipher the hieroglyphics thanks to this Rosetta Stone. If he hadn't done that, we couldn't be able to know what we nowadays know about Egypt. Then we're going to talk about the sacred books. We start in the 100 before Christ with the translation of the Torah. Let's say it's the Old Testament, but it's called the law. In fact, that is the meaning of Torah, as the law. And then it was translated as the Bible, but the Bible means the book. And well, from the 280 before Christ to the 100, Hebrew and Aramaic, which were the languages in which the Torah was written, was transferred into Greek Koine. As I said, this was the times of Alexander the Great. It is called the Septuagint. And the Koine was the common language of Greece. After that, we know about Christ, and then the heritage of Christ, or what's known as the Christ history, is recorded in the Gospels. The Gospels were written in both Greek and Coptic at the same time. Coptic was the modern, well, it's not modern, but during the first century, the old this language was the one that took place and to Egypt. So instead of speaking Demotic, now we have Coptic in Egypt, and Coptic was the sacred language of Egypt. And then the Greek Gospels and the now transferred, the Greek Bible or the Old Testament, were transferred from Greek into Latin by Saint Jerome. After that, we have other sacred writings, which the Buddhist monk Kumara Yiba transferred from Sanskrit to Chinese. So that's why Buddhism became so important in China. During the 7th and the 8th century, the only, let's say, the most intact part of the Torah, or the Old Testament, was transferred from Old Hebrew. They added small dots. So let's say that this is the original version of the Bible, the old version of the Bible. In the 9th century, some ecclesiastical history was transferred from Latin to English. And we know that during the Middle Ages, the dominant language was Latin. And so there was a Toledo School of Translators that transferred Arabic, Greek, Hebrew writings or works into Latin, which was the lingua franca, as I said, because it was very important. In the 14th century, Latin stopped being so important. It stayed there for a long time yet, but now it was transferred into vernaculars. One of them was English. Geoffrey Chaucer transferred literature from Latin to English, and John Wycliffe transferred the Latin Bible into English. So we say that the English Bible has 500 years. Geoffrey Chaucer spoke English, Latin, and French, and as I said, it transferred some literature into English. We are going to mention some translators that helped colonize the Americas and also Asia. We have Gaspar Antonio Chi, a Mayan guy who learned Spanish and Latin and helped with Spanish colonization, and also La Malinche, whose original name was Malinatzin and was known by the Spaniards like Doña Marina. She spoke Nahuatl Mayan and learned Spanish and helped with the colonization. She was given to Hernan Cortés, and she helped him with the conquest in Mexico. Sakagawa was an Indian American. She spoke Shoshone and learned English and helped with the colonization in America. Alexander Burns was a British explorer who spoke English, Persian, Urdu, and Hindi and helped with Indian colonization. Now, after that, in the 20th century, well, Jorge Luis Borges learned, was a very intelligent guy. At 9, when he was 9, he started translating from English. Although he was not a professional translator, he transferred English, French, German, and Old English and Old Norse literature into Spanish. And after that, in the late 20th century, James Holmes coined the term translation. He was a poet, but he started working, or he published a very important work in translation. Thanks to him, we have a lot of information about translation. During those times, the translation was very important, but it lost a bit of importance due to the fact of, or the appearance of the machine translation and computer assisted translation, which has undergone into the translators disappearance in a way. But still, translators are important because they brush up the translation works, and they work thanks to that. All right. We're going to now talk about translation. So just first, as I said, the term translation appeared first in the 1340. It derives from the old French translation, well, Latin translation, and then came from the verb transfer, or to carry over. And well, it is, well, that's the history. The process of translation is goes from the source text and the source language to the target text and the target language. Uh, and we're going to talk about the history of translation. We already mentioned Cicero and Jerome. There was a question or a matter of translating word by word or sense by sense. That's how Saint Jerome says. And we already talked about him. So it was in Roman times that Cicero appeared, and he made some translations. Then the fact this sense by sense was said by Saint Jerome, and it's something that has gone on and on for a long time. Etienne Dolet in the 1540 stated some translating principles that are still like current. The translator must perfectly understand the sense of the material of the original author, and then the translation should have perfect knowledge of the source language and the target language. The translation should avoid word for word translation, and should avoid latinate and unusual forms. The translation should assemble the lese words in a good manner. Then John Dinson's category change in metaphrase, which is word by word; paraphrase, which involves changing the whole phrases; imitation, which is uh, taking both words and senses and trying to find a correspondent letter, phrase, and word. Some Alexander Fraser Tyler's principles of translation from the 1990s is that translation should give a complete transcript of the ideas. The style and manner of writing should have the same manner as the original, and that translation ha- has to have like the closest meaning to the original. Now we talk about the 20th century. We mentioned Holmes in the previous activity. His translation studies helped to set this form, which is pure translation or applied translation. And pure translation involved theoretical and descriptive translation, and then applied translation, help translation, translator training, translator aids, translator criticism. And as I said, these studies helped setting the basis of translation in the 20th century. Eh, Traditional translation categories are rewording, translation proper, and transmutation. In rewording, we interpret the verbal signs into words, which is the case of Chinese here. Then interlingual is the verbal signs. We change it into the other language. And intersemiotic translation or transmutation is the verbal sign by means of signs of nonverbal systems. And we have here some translation models. That's what we work with. These translation models are different, and this is for specialists in those branches. This critical model focuses on the process. The process is no, doesn't focus on the process. It just focuses on the target text. And the next model, the practical model, it's the process is important in order to know where, how, or where what the origin of the text is, so to understand both parts. So the process is important in this practical model. The linguistic model says that translation makes statements about the mechanisms of transfer from source language to target language. Here we have Japanese, and this division basically, we have to know that there are particles that are not able to be translated. We transfer it, but the characteristics of each language go in a different way. So we have we don't the in English, for example, we have the verb to be. In Japanese, we don't have it, but we have particles that allow us to know if it's a sentence or complement a sentence. That's the text linguistic model maintains the original text and translate the differences and the level. The model is like the previous linguistic model, but it is an expansion to discourse analysis. So we have this triangle, and that is the discourse analysis that we make for this thing. And then we have the sociocultural model that says that translation is not really cannot be achieved because it is a different product. There and this model texts are either not translatable or are corruption of the original source. That's the main reason why the Quran is not translated, because it loses its meaning, and that is there's many synonyms, but they don't have an exact meaning in English, for example, or and in this case it's French. And so that is why the sociocultural model states. Then the computational model is what we nowadays know, because we use computer assisted translation and machine translation, which requires little human assistance. And now we have more advanced programs that help us understand this. That psychological model says that stays on the process of translating in the mind. It has not been widely studied, but it's a think out loud protocols. While the translator is working, he is asked to tell the researcher what the process he is in, and so this has not been yet studied, but as a model that uh, whose aim is to know about the translation steps and the translation process in the mind. Vinay and Darle translation steps are to identify the new units of translation, to examine the source language, to reconstruct the metalinguistic context, and to evaluate the stylistic effects and produce and revise the text. Then the Sohar polysystem theory emphasizes the literature operates as a system itself in the way target language culture selects works from translation and the norms. And it insists on the Venuti insists that the scope of translation studies need to be broadened to take account into the value of driven nature of sociocultural nature. Nowadays, we have uh, some current issues that say that we have want to preserve the target language in the target language what is in the source language, and we have questions regarding the fact that if the values or the foreign values disappear in translation, or if all the everything is bound to of value is bound to it, the linguistic form, or can information content be separated from linguistic and textual forms? Um, the House's model of translation says that there are two types of translation: an overt translation and a covert translation. An overt translation is that we are going to translate the exact way the text is into the target language. We do not pretend it to be original. Whereas in the covert translation, we have the language transferred, and let's say that it says we speak English, and then when we translate it to Spanish, decimos hablamos español. So we transfer the complete idea so that it becomes part of the culture, and the aim is to make it fit into the culture. That what most cartoons do nowadays when they make or translate the cartoons. These are some guidelines that UNESCO dictated, and now we're going to go to the last part of this video. For this part, we first of all have arguments for translation and arguments against translation. First, we are going to analyze the arguments for translation, or why we use translation in as a tool, a teaching tool. Okay, for humanistic reasons, learning is easier when students feel relaxed and free, and so students sometimes when they are speaking the target language all the time, they feel frustrated, and that's the humanistic reason. Practical reasons, it saves time. There are arguments against this, but this is the reason. Then cognitive reasons, even when we avoid the use of the source language or the first language, the mental process is to translate. Many students translate with while they're learning a second language. Political reasons, the direct method, which is a method that uses this first language all the time, the target language all the time, is not possible with large groups because politics or cannot afford to pay for teachers for small classes. And then technical reasons, nowadays we have a lot of devices and tools that allow us to translate immediately. So it's easy to use a translation as a teaching tool. Okay, we're going to talk about the professional translators. Professional translators need proficiency in both the target language and the source language. Uh, they need to have a lot of background knowledge in their own culture and the target language. So the curricula and the professional translators um, um, need the bicultural and bilingual curricula that includes civilization, culture, politics, and economics of both languages. Because, as we say, we need to have a mastery of both languages. Otherwise, we if we lack a proficiency of the source language or the target language, and we lack intercultural competence and sensitivity, will not have enough vocabulary. We would not recognize registers. We would not even have basic punctuation, spelling errors. And I have found that sometimes this lack of mastery of the mother tongue makes it very difficult to transfer it to another language. Uh, some advantages of using translation and class for teaching a second language are that there is a conscious learning of the foreign language, that there is a checking of accuracy, there it elicits awareness of the content and forms cognitive, and there are some cognitive and psychological reasons, because the learner is participating actively in the process. It is obviously different from the first language acquisition. The learner needs to make use of background knowledge, and there is always a mental process of translation going on through the learning the second language process. Translation reduces the learn, but there are some disadvantages, and it is important because translation reduces the learner's exposure to target language. It leads to first language interference, and it's only feasible on monolingual classes. So I would say to use this if we have a lot of time. If not, we can just use it as a homework, because it also encourages thinking in first language and transfer to the second language. And some aims of language learning are not achieved through translation. It is nowadays considered a fifth skill. It's not included in the four skills, but however, it is known to be a fifth skill. Some strategies that we can use in order to use translation as a teaching tool are preparation exercises, parallel text. First, we translate from the target language to the source language because it's easier. And then we transfer from the first language to the second language because we need a bit of information about the second language and it's a bit harder. Then we check on textual features, and finally we check from process to product, and we work on the conclusions. Then, well, just to summarize, in during the 20th century, the grammar translation method was very popular because the aim was to understand. So it was based on um, comprehension. But later on, there was a need to communicate. So there was a reform movement that called for this communication. And then, well, so the direct method appeared as a direct method to enhance production skills. So, but however, learning a language needs a lot of commitment, and not all the people want to commit to this hard but interesting task. And for these people, there are now tools that help us interpreting, or machines that help us translating, and there are apps, and there is the internet that we can use programs to translate. Not all the meaning is transferred, but the basic, we can have a basic understanding of a foreign language. So, well, that's it for today. That's what we can talk about translation. Have a good time. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.